Good morning, and welcome to this episode of Governance Dialogues, a program that I have the pleasure to host on a weekly basis, and a program in which we're canvassing a number of practical and philosophical topics in the world of governance. And over the last 2 months, for those of you who have joined this program, we've had a chance to discuss topics as diverse as governance of international institutions, to effectiveness of boards, to some of the corruption and fraud risks that have been brought to fore by the current crisis. And today I would like to take a slightly longer term perspective and focus on a perhaps the most fundamental debate in the field of governance today. And that is the transition from the shareholder to the stakeholder model that has dominated the corporate governance world as we know it. And for those of you who are familiar with the field, of course, the shareholderism model has been pioneered by Milton Friedman's seminal work, and has since then been a number of thinkers have forcefully argued, of course, beginning with Merrick Dodd, but also more recently, Margaret Blair, Lynn Stout, and many others have argued for the need to transition to a more inclusive approach where boards and CEOs or C-suites more generally, are considering the range of other stakeholders, not only their shareholders. And today, I have the pleasure to host a special guest who is potentially could be called the father of the stakeholder theory as we know it, or debate as we've seen it unfolding currently. And Colin Mayer is a professor of management at the Oxford Said Business School. He's the former dean of the Oxford Business School. He has a number of other titles. Notably, he leads the Future of the Corporation project at the British Academy, which is currently focusing its work on the issue of stakeholderism amongst other important topics. And Colin has a number of titles. He's the fellow of the British Academy, fellow of the European Corporate Governance Institute, the Royal Society of Arts, and many others that perhaps I don't remember all. But Colin, thank you very much for joining us from the UK today.
Delighted to be with you, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you share your thoughts on this important subject. I know this is a key area of your work today at the Future of the Corporation project, but also in terms of your own writing and books. And I would like to get specifically right away into the topic of stakeholderism and the current crisis and how you see things unfolding from here. I mean, we've seen in the last perhaps few months enormous statements. One, of course, by the World Economic Forum, which issued this manifesto urging its companies or companies that it works with to transition to the stakeholder model. We've seen the Business Roundtable in the US take a strong position on it. And yet those like, for example, Lucian Bebchuk, with whom you've had a dialogue this week, argue that these manifestos or promises have not actually materialized in practical results, i.e. companies have not amended their corporate governance statements and whatnot. And I would like to ask you if you think that the COVID crisis has actually fastened the rate or the pace of change towards stakeholderism, or if you think it perhaps put some brakes on this transition.
No, it's unquestionably accelerated it, because there's a growing realization of the importance of purpose in defining what companies should be doing in bringing themselves out of the crisis. What purpose does is to provide a precise notion of how companies need to prioritize the various trade-offs they have to make between their different interested parties, between their employees and their customers in terms of cutting prices or retaining jobs, between societies in delivering solutions to the pandemic problem, or retaining their dividends for their pensioners. And furthermore, what a purpose does is to give companies a notion as to how they can build themselves out of the crisis and how they should be responding to the changing preferences on our part between ways of working and things we want to purchase going forward. That presents significant opportunities for companies as well as risks, and provided that they have a clear notion of what their purpose is, which is about their fundamental reason for being, then that provides them with a clear notion as to how they should move forward in a way that creates value for their shareholders as well as benefits for society as a whole.
Okay, and actually, Colin, if I may just follow up with a quick question on a word that you mentioned that I think is particularly important, and that is trade-offs. And indeed, that is perhaps the most complex issue in this stakeholderism debate, is that we're talking about, when we look at multinational companies, they have a variety of stakeholders in various jurisdictions with various laws that apply. I mean, do you have thoughts as to how these trade-offs can actually be measured, how boards can actually operationalize these trade-offs in their decision-making process? Because that is indeed perhaps the most, the crux or the most complicated issue at hand, no?
Yes, and that's precisely what a purpose is very good at doing, because what a purpose does is to say what a company should not be doing as well as what it should be doing. So it helps to delineate those areas on which it is focusing. And by a notion of a purpose, what I mean is that companies are there to solve problems that we face as individuals and societies around the world, and to do so in a commercially viable and profitable way. So I define it as being to produce profitable solutions, the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people or planet. Now, what a purpose then does is to say companies need to define what the problems are that they're going to solve, for whom, how they're going to solve them, and when. And that then translates itself into the governance of a company. That is to say, it is embedded by the directors of the firm, by the executives, and then the board, in terms of specifying precisely how it's going to reflect that purpose in terms of the objectives throughout the organization. Key to that is the measurement of the purpose. So one of the elements that purpose helps to do is to define the metrics against which companies should be evaluating their performance, and to establish the basis on which they can evaluate whether or not the profits that they are creating are indeed profits that are not coming at the expense of other members of society and are delivering on the purpose of the company. So giving real force to the notion of purpose is a way of establishing what are the measures against which companies should be evaluated and the boards held to account for what they're doing.
So some of the words that you mentioned, of course, are key to this debate: purpose and mission. And indeed, what we've seen, and you certainly follow these developments, but I think it's interesting to share with our audience, the evolution of the corporate law, in particular in countries like where you are currently in the UK, but also in France, where governments have actually amended corporate law to allow companies to subsequently amend their articles of association to explicitly include this responsibility to stakeholders. And I think Danone probably was, to my knowledge, the first company who's done so, and now modified its articles of association. The company now has what they call a mission committee, which is distinct from the board committee, and has one employee, and also a verification by an independent third party of the execution of this mission in a way that is then rendered public. So I think it's a very interesting mechanism. You know, in reality, of course, we don't know how it will play out and how effective it will be in the long term. But I wonder what your thoughts are on the actual government action in terms of fostering this thinking of stakeholderism and encouraging companies to move that way, and whether you believe that there are further opportunities to refine corporate laws such that C-suites and boards are responsible to a broader range of stakeholders. Has enough been done by governments, is my question, I guess. Over to you.
Well, first of all, let's be clear that companies can do an immense amount under existing law. So it's no excuse really to say that the law isn't adequate for companies to be able to move forward on this. In virtually every country around the world, it is perfectly feasible for companies to adopt, state a purpose, and implement it as part of the existing legal structure. What has, however, happened is that in some countries, most notably France, but elsewhere as well, there have been legal developments which have put purpose at the center of corporate law. A good example of this is the legal form that was adopted in the United States, the Public Benefit Corporation, by which the directors of a company need to state a purpose that they uphold alongside delivering profits for their shareholders. In France, the Société à Mission is an illustration of a way in which purpose has been put into the legal framework. Now, doing that is of benefit insofar as it then provides an obligation on companies to promote a purpose, and it provides a degree of protection of the directors of a company that are pursuing a purpose from being deflected by other investors, activists, shareholders, hostile takeover bids from fulfilling that purpose. So it is a significant way of allowing companies to commit to their corporate purpose, which otherwise it's hard for them to do. But to take the UK as an example, companies are beginning to recognize that they can do quite a lot of this on their own. So, for example, Anglian Water in the UK has put their corporate purpose into their articles of association as a way of binding themselves under the existing legal structure.
So that is very interesting, some of the examples, and I think that it's a very new evolution. So we'll have to obviously follow and see how companies are actually going about it, and how these promises are materializing, especially in the case of Danone and some of the UK companies that you mentioned. But I would like to switch tone and focus now on investors. And you mentioned the role of investors in the story, and of course, in parallel with stakeholderism debates in the last 5 or so years, we've seen an immense shift of responsibilities, at least in my personal view, somewhat from governments towards institutional investors in terms of their responsibility for oversight of ESG. And it's an immense responsibility that's given to institutional investors today. And I wonder if you have thoughts as to whether they're prepared, and how prepared are they in monitoring such a wide variety of governance, environmental and social responsibility, especially in this crisis that has also resulted in massive layoffs, and in the context of the industry, which today is, as many call it now, the big three. Are the big three up to the task?
Well, this is changing very rapidly. So until recently, the answer is no, they were not sufficiently prepared for the change, but they have moved considerably over the last few months under significant pressure, external pressure, for them to recognize the significance of, in particular, environmental issues in terms of the way in which they steward companies in which they're investing. What COVID has done is to move that one stage further in terms of putting the S in ESG, society, at the heart of what institutional investors are responsible for as well. And the Black Lives Matter campaign has gone even further in emphasizing the importance of S. But I think it's critically important to realize that things are moving beyond that, because what I'm talking about is the notion that a purpose of a company provides a specification of the way in which companies should be seeking to take forward their activities. And so what is being realized is that the role of institutional investors is not simply to measure ESG, but to recognize its role in stewarding the purpose of companies, to establishing whether or not companies have adopted a purpose, to evaluate that purpose, to establish whether or not companies are effectively implementing it. And one of the elements of that is to evaluate the extent to which they are measuring their performance against their purpose, and ESG is valuable in that regard. But it should not be regarded as the be-all and end-all. This is about delivering purpose in business and investors stewarding that in the firms in which they're investing.
I think so. Of course, we'll be discussing in future episodes of this program the role of different participants in the investment value chain. Of course, institutional investors, but also the role of auditors. And I think that's been under spotlight. And you use the word stewardship and oversight. And recently, in a number of cases, especially on some that we're working on, such as the NMC case, an Emirati company that's listed was listed on the London Stock Exchange. there was enormous scandal around the work of ENY, and their responsibilities and how they missed major related party transactions. And that is not the only case. Of course, it's just one example of many that are coming to the shore. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm wondering if you think we're seeing kind of a second wave post the Anderson dissolution of kind of a focus on the role of auditors, and whether you think that in the current environment, even with the further requirements around rotations of partners or audit firms, whether the regulation of audit firms is sufficient, especially vis-a-vis governance, or whether further thinking is merited by policymakers around the role of audit firms. And for example, should audit firms be responsible to also review board reports and actually vouch of how accurate or serious they are? Over to you.
Yes, there are serious governance issues and problems that arise in relation to auditing. For one thing, the way in which audit companies are appointed and to whom they're accountable seems to be upside down. That is to say that they should be responsible to the party for whom essentially the audit reports are being produced. And that is first and foremost for the investors and the shareholders in the company, but also for society more generally and other stakeholders in the firm. At the moment, they're employed by the company to undertake the activity. And so that degree of accountability to the shareholder community is not sufficiently well embedded in the way in which the auditing process is set up in the first place. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that there's a clear distinction between the role of accountancy firms in terms of the services that they provide to companies and advising and consultancy advice that they provide, and the auditing function. And those two functions need to have a clearer distinction between them. The latter is a public role. And it basically comes back to what I was saying earlier on, that the nature of the legal structure that is relevant to that type of activity is very different from a pure commercial one in terms of providing advice to a company. So, for example, the notion of there being a public benefit obligation on those who are running the auditing company should be quite distinct from that of the rest of an accountancy firm. Thirdly, the point I want to make is that the role that auditors should be performing should indeed be directly in relation to what we're talking about as being the objective of a company, the implementation of its purpose. There should be an auditing requirement on companies to establish whether or not they have determined their purpose appropriately and whether or not they are effectively implementing their purpose and correctly measuring their performance against it. And in particular, auditing companies should be responsible for establishing whether or not companies are failing to fulfill their purposes and indeed reflecting profits that come in terms of producing problems at the expense of the rest of society and the natural world.
So perhaps I would like to switch a little bit from the more detailed, specific questions around various participants in the investment value chain, and leave the last two questions that I would like to ask you before we part on the future of the global economy, on the future of capitalism, some of the lessons learned. And one of the things that we're witnessing and we've been discussing in conversations on this program, notably with some CEOs of stock exchanges that I've been hosting, is the sort of the divorce, if I may say so, between the real economy and the market performance. And there has been a number of explanations that have been provided, of course, in the context of the US by the prevalence of the tech firms and what they've done to keep the market's valuations up. But I would like to ask you, from more of an observer and a governance point of view, do you think that the perception of the public in terms of market performance and the divorce from the real economy might drive further distrust between in the financial sphere, as we've seen post the last financial crisis?
It accentuates the sense that there are two worlds. There are worlds that most of us inhabit, which are difficult worlds where a lot of people have lost their jobs, where they're encountering serious social, psychological problems, and another world where people appear to be doing very well out of the crisis. Now, in some respects, this does reflect the very different performance of different types of companies in the economy, where quite clearly some have played a major role in allowing us to go on functioning and to interact with each other in a way which would otherwise have been inconceivable. Now, it is quite appropriate, therefore, that some companies are profiting from what is currently happening. But what has also happened is that we've had this massive injection of public funding into the corporate sector to bail it out. And one of the reasons why the stock market implication has not been worse than it has been to date is that it's been largely supported by the monetary injections that have taken place, which have driven down the cost of capital and then therefore raised share prices. Now, it's critically important that business recognizes going forward that that is part of a social compact by which business is expected to help build us out of the current crisis, and to do so in a way that is regarded as fairly treating different parties of societies, different stakeholders, as well as shareholders. And otherwise, there will be a serious loss of trust in business, even more serious than there has been to date. That's exactly what happened after the financial crisis, when there was a lot of initial public support for bailing out the banks, but that quickly evaporated and became disdain when it was realized that the banks did not recognize their social license to operate. It is vitally important that companies do not make the same mistake this time round.
I agree, and I think that we've been also writing quite a bit from government's perspective on government injections, equity injections directly into companies, what that means for competition. And I think some of the effects that of these rescue operations will be with us for a number of years, especially in sectors like airlines and many others. But I would like to close perhaps with one big picture question. On the future of capitalism. That goes, I think, to the heart of the work that you are leading at the Future of the Corporation project. And if we look at sort of the political, and we overlay the political and the economic developments today, we're seeing basically enormous political and economic tensions between US and China, these government injections accompanied by a rise of investment protection mechanisms that are, I would say, quite unprecedented, even in the listed companies. Some examples, for example, like in the US, where the Trump administration had recently ordered some of the local funds not to invest in Chinese equity. So if you look at all these various moving parts in the economy, and even before the crisis, cases like Snapchat, which went public without voting shares or voting rights attached to their shares. Do you believe that all these different moving parts of the bandwagon are essentially a bell that's tolling for existential shift in the capitalist modus operandi going forward?
Yes, they reflect a fundamental disquiet with the way in which the system has operated to date, and a recognition that it needs to change in fundamental ways. And it will indeed be the case that we will encounter increasing crises of greater frequency and greater intensity going forward, unless we begin to address some of the defects that exist within the existing system. And why is this happening? It comes back to the notion of purpose that I was talking about earlier on, and that is the second part of it, not profiting at the expense of other parties. There's been a great deal of that. It's reflected in terms of the environmental degradation, growing levels of inequality in terms of wealth and income, and the strong sense of social exclusion that many people feel around the world. Now, so long as that continues to happen and mount, then we will find that there will be a serious reaction on the part of societies and on governments and from different parts of the world in terms of the way in which they feel that business needs to be rectified going forward. It therefore comes back to the point that business needs to be on the front foot. It needs to take this into its own hands and demonstrate that it can really respond without the need for excessive government intervention around the world to ensure that there is a restoration of at least some element of trust in business going forward.
Thank you so much, Colin, for those thoughts. I think that you clearly draw a link, and this is what we're trying to do in this program, between the world of governance and technical regulation and policy, and real effects on people's lives, social impact, environmental impact, and others. So with that, I think I would like to thank you very much for your time and for sharing your views. And I would like to invite our audience who are perhaps interested to learn more about some of the work you're leading at the British Academy project, and also others to have a look at your site. But thank you so much for joining us for today's dialogue.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed our discussion a great deal. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. And for our viewers, we'll be back next week with further episodes, and I'll leave the topic as a bit of a surprise on various emerging governance priorities. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Governance Dialogues.